Yeah, it doesn't sound weird to me because I think that is the core of shadow work. It's like you engage with somebody and there's something you don't like about them. And there's probably that same part within you that's pushed away or repressed. Have you heard of parts work? It's
Yeah,
very like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
a
Yeah, I've
very
heard of it.
big modality. So a lot of it is like that. Like there's all these different parts of ourselves, and we have parts that we like, or we have parts that we have a better relationship with, and those kind of they're at the forefront, and then you have these other parts that are often unconscious, and then every once in a while they'll get triggered or bubble up, and that's when we get a glimpse, and we're like, oh my god, that's I was acting out of character, that wasn't me. But it's like, no, yes, that was you too, that was another part of you. But that's just, there's these aspects of ourselves that we don't want to see. So it's interesting how you can apply the same stuff in dream work and in while you're awake, while you're moving around the world.
Yeah, it scared me a lot because if you haven't acknowledged that part in you, and something that's been coming up recently is like my capacity to be dangerous, and it's not something I've ever assumed was true about myself, right? Like I do jujitsu like badly, but I like to think I'm like a nice guy and like humble, and I'm running this community full of really powerful people now. And what the universe was like, nah, dude, you're dangerous. You have more potential, more positive potential than you realized you did, but that means you have more darkness. And the problem is if you haven't integrated that part is going to get activated at a time when you're not emotionally equipped to handle it. Like if you can see it, you're at a big advantage. Like you're not going to necessarily win the game, but like it's integrated and you're like, oh, that thing's showing up again. But if you can't even see it, you don't even know it's there, when suddenly something happens to trigger it, you're going to go nuts and things are going to get out of control real fast.
Yeah. Jordan Peterson talks a lot about that, about this idea that like you have to realize that you're a monster. And there's nothing noble in not doing evil things or destroying something when you're like not capable of it. Like a rabbit is innocent and they don't do anything. But like for a lion or a gorilla, being the embodiment of that kind of an animal and not acting on that, that's where there's nobility. It's like knowing that you can hurt, you can destroy. I'm capable of doing that, but I figured out how to work with that energy and transmute it in a way where I don't act on that.
Dude, I've spent more time thinking about Jordan Peterson than any man alive, as in not me, but like thinking about him, right? Like it's why is his house filled with pictures of tyrants and dictators and communist propaganda? Because it's him, right? Like the pivot he's made, in my personal opinion, to like his public persona right now, there is a part of him, like, I don't know if you've ever heard this story, but in Maps of Meaning, which is like a wild,
love that book.
Yeah, it's an almost psychedelic book, right? Like he tells this story about the voice in his head, where basically like when he was like in his 20s, he'd say stuff that sounded smart and he'd win debates because he's so smart. And then a voice in his head would say, you don't believe that. And then he'd get a panic attack. And he didn't know which side of his psyche he was until he'd only say stuff the censor would let through. And it pulled him together psychologically, but also I think gave him a sense for the sacred, for what was archetypally true, which is how this pretty obscure professor ends up having a following of tens, maybe hundreds of millions, definitely hundreds of millions of people. But he still has this vulnerability, which is this left hemispheric like takeover, the tyrant that he talks about incredibly articulately throughout his work, this satanic voice that you hear him speak with when he goes on podcasts, whenever he talks about like climate change or gender or politics or like Trudeau or any of these things that are all like touch points for his audience. And whenever he talks about stuff he really understands, like mythology and psychology and symbolism, like he talks with a completely different kind of voice and authority. And it really interests me that like that strikes me as an unintegrated part. And David Fuller, the guy that ran Rebel Wisdom, wrote a really interesting piece about him, which is now seems to have been scrubbed off the internet. But basically was like, this guy had no grounding. He was a literal lightning rod for the culture wars, and he had no grounding. He didn't have embodiment practices, and he probably didn't have a community around him to tell him he was being an idiot. And like, that's a risk factor for me. Like, it's not like I've got hundreds of millions. I don't have tens of people, but it's a risk for all of us that can speak fluently to be like, which are you talking without your heart engaged? And whenever I see people online, it really triggers me, which shows my risk factor, right? Like, all of these guys that can talk really, really articulately about stuff, but they don't embody it.
Yeah. In hearing that, what comes up, and like, I'm a huge Peterson fan. And, you hear kind of critiques of him and kind of how the direction he kind of went. But I see there's this dynamic between kind of truth and love, and, kind of being really sharp and smart, and then the heart and the embodiment. And like, I have a propensity to lean into truth, and I feel like he does too. And you can become very kind of abrasive, you know, and lose your sense of humanity, or get almost like too serious. And that's what I noticed that happens with him. And I see that same pattern playing out in me. But I am wondering about the pictures of the tyrants, because like, I was when you were saying that, I was thinking about Ram Dass and how he used to have a picture of Donald Trump and a picture of Obama as like a way to integrate, like, yes, there's a Trump in me and there's an Obama in me, and like, all of these people are in me. Like, it's all just a play in my psyche.
Dude, yeah. I think about it all the time, right? Like, the sign that someone still triggers me is a sign that I probably haven't dealt with it.